This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Tom Brown, welcome to Human Coined.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here with you.
We've been wanting to do this for a while.
Yeah.
You are the author of In the Mind of the Minister. And how did you come about writing this book? Let's start with that.
Well, I'll tell you now that the title came at the end. I didn't start with the title. I wrote the whole book without knowing what the title was going to be. I felt like that was probably the right way to do this, and that's because the I suppose the starting question that I had was what has gone wrong in the relationship between ministers and civil servants, and I was looking particularly at the UK. I've since discovered that a lot of the issues that I explored are the case in most other countries. It turns out. So it turns out, no one's unique. One of the first comments I had from some of my contacts in the Caribbean and West Africa, and also in South Asia, they said, "Oh, I know you wrote this about Britain, but this could have been Nigeria or India or Barbados." So it turns out some of these challenges are the case in lots of different government contexts. But we in the UK, having come off the back of a self-inflicted crisis in terms of Brexit and a global crisis in terms of COVID, I've been in a perennial crisis. Well, it felt like it for about 8 years. And during that time, there was some extremely high profile, which is not normal in the sort of historical journey of civil servants and ministers working together, of really high profile fallings out between ministers and permanent secretaries. We had a really low moment in 2020, so during the pandemic, when I think we had 6 permanent secretaries removed one way or the other. They didn't want to leave, and they were forced to in some manner in the space of a few months. That's never happened before, and the first couple of those was when we heard a real increase in the use of the word unprecedented, and that's before unprecedented became normal parlance for all of us. It was just before COVID started, and it was unprecedented. And I really wanted to explore, like, is this just a freak moment in time, or is this something that's just gone on for a longer period? And how can this be improved? How can ministers work better with civil servants? Because ultimately, we in democracies, at least, we elect politicians. Those politicians, in some manner, they form a government, and they have a mandate on which they operate, which is the promises that they've made. But to deliver the promises that they've made, they need the machine to deliver it, and that is the civil service in most instances. So when that trust is broken, it's a democratic threat, in my view, because it means that it's much more difficult to deliver the promises that you've been elected to actually deliver. So those are sort of some of the things that kind of pushed me to look a bit more into this. And I guess the final thing I'll say on that is that having kind of worked in this space and worked in between, in the UK, it's in between Whitehall and Westminster, we call it, but in between government and politicians and ministers and civil servants, it's people's own experiences which help you see. Will help you lift the curtain and see what's really happening. And so the foundation of the book really is lots and lots of interviews that I conducted. I got some of them on the record, and lots of them were not as well. Just to share, I suppose, just to sort of demonstrate and explore that everyone's experience is a bit different, and there isn't really a formula for this, but there are some guiding ways to do it better.
And I'm dying to get into the book itself, but before we get there, why don't you just talk a bit about the work that you do professionally and how that maybe helped you write the book or inspired you to write the book? And I was also thinking, by the way, sorry to interrupt at the end of the question, that it's very
reminds me of something I would do in terms of, you're working 60 hours a week, and then when you have time to relax and unwind, you're, writing a book, right?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I'd recommend that actually. If I'm honest, there's some lack of wisdom in doing that. But yeah, I work in a larger company that is now called Total Politics, and we work in lots of different geographical contexts. But we work with governments, with civil servants, public officials, and also with politicians as well. And that's in we have offices in Brussels and London and Edinburgh and elsewhere in the world. But on my side of things, most of what we do is training and learning and development and building skills. So we do lots in the policy and the communication spaces. We work with MPs and ministers around the world. We work a lot with international institutions, and we do a lot of policy training for public servants as well. It's that's sort of what I call the space in between. So between the officials and the ministers, I find myself in that space quite a lot, and it's a space that I enjoy being sort of an observer of, and also finding myself sitting alongside sometimes.
And as I mentioned in our preamble, our pre-interview discussion, when it comes to the book, I felt that it presupposed that you were referring to the what I would call the cabinet parliamentary system, which is very much the Westminster system. In my
Yeah,
opinion, that system doesn't exist anymore in Canada. I mean, a lot of people feel that that system has been replaced by heavy control from the center, which is in our case the Prime Minister's office, the PMO. I think in your case that would be Whitehall, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah,
or
yeah,
10 Downing Street, one or the
yeah,
other,
yeah.
right? Tell me about whether I'm idealizing your system as still having that cabinet parliamentary feature to it.
Um, I think I think it really depends on who's in office. So 10 Downing Street is still powerful, and ultimately still calling the shots. But different. We've had a lot of prime ministers in the last few years, more than we normally would in that space of
I've
time.
been following the news.
Yeah, that's right. And large, by and large, they've been quite different from each other actually in terms of their style. Um, the the structure in the UK is that we have a private office system for ministers. So within the private office is a small group of civil servants around the minister that
Right,
act almost as kind of the nucleus for their operation,
right.
and most things go through them, and they are very loyal to ministers, and ministers like them very much. When a minister is um, that suits a kind of governance by minister or government of ministers, which is what we're supposed to have in the UK. We don't have a written constitution, but we do have sets of precedents, and we do have some guiding codes. And the ministerial code is very supportive of having a government of ministers. But we have had some what you might call sort of more directive, stronger leaders. I think maybe like Tony Blair is a good example of this, where the largely the direction from the centre has been much stronger, and you would say that ministers kind of can be overridden. I think the current Prime Minister Keir Starmer is still waiting to see how that plays out because he's actually quite adjustable. I don't think he's necessarily got any fixed guiding stars from a policy perspective. And even last week, there's examples of this every week, but UK has just signed a trade agreement with India, and there's lots of controversy about this now in the UK, whereby there's a relaxation of visa rules for, I think, for some Indian workers coming to the UK. That the Home Secretary was not part of that arrangement and didn't know until that had been agreed. So sometimes we do still get this overriding of ministers, and I think it does vary quite a lot. There are instances where ministers are just left alone to probably
Well,
David
let's not call
Cameron's a
that
bit
an
more like
override.
this.
Sorry to interrupt. Let's not call that an override. Let's call that them being left out of the process almost entirely and decisions being made without them,
True.
right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. That's
No.
right. It's not. You're right. It's not an override. It's not a decision which has been rejected.
That's right.
But maybe it's control being taken by
Yeah.
the centre. But if we look at maybe sort of something like in the coalition government that the UK had in 2010 to 2015, ministers were left absolutely more to their own domains, and that was one of the, in the UK at least, one of the impacts I think of having a coalition government. It was not possible necessarily for the prime minister
Right.
to be completely in
Control
control of
the other
everything.
parties, control the Lib Dems. Yeah.
Yeah, and even their own ministers. I think in that instance, quite a lot of domestic policy was more siloed, and each department was led by the minister who had their own set of things that they wanted to do. I'm not necessarily segueing to the book here, but one of the people I interviewed was Vince Cable, who was the business secretary for all 5 years of the coalition, and a lot of what he set out to achieve, he did, and he wasn't interrupted that much by the Treasury, where he might have been under another government. So I think we have a mixed bag in the UK, and I think perhaps that's probably reflective of the breathable nature of our constitutional structure, which is that we're not fixed necessarily to do particular things. One thing I will add, though, and I think one of my big takeaways and big points really of the book is that precedent is really probably the most important element of the way that the UK operates, and I think that probably does translate into other contexts as well. Because the thing with precedent is like you can lower the floor of expectations of acceptability, or you can raise the ceiling of expectations, and the lowering the floor of acceptability in terms of precedent is one of the problems that we've had in the UK, which is that, and is exactly the case in the US now, which is that things which would not have been acceptable under a previous government now are acceptable because they've been done before, or they've been done, and you can't, and the next government can't come in and say, the next government can come in and do exactly the same thing, and they can say, well, it was okay last time, this is okay now, and that's a danger for incumbent governments too, because you are setting precedent for the point at which power changes hands. And when you're suddenly in opposition, would you be comfortable with another party or another political flavour doing exactly what you are doing, but in their own flavour, as it were?
Yeah, and you mentioned in the book, you say here, quote, another suggestion for change I encountered was to the nature of the relationship itself. The relationship between civil servants and ministers continues to be based on convention, precedent, and understanding. For a considerable time, this has worked well, more often than not, but the world has changed a great deal in the past 40 years, let alone 150. Can you talk a bit about how the blowing up of the civil service in the United States may have impacted, and that of course happened after you published the book. Would you write
Yeah,
anything different now? Would you be a bit more stark about the dangers of leaving things just to precedent?
I guess in the US, the level of political appointments is much higher than in the
That's true.
UK.
Yeah.
So we have what's called a permanent civil service in the respect that we don't have many political appointees, some, but it's pretty limited. Whereas obviously in the US, there's a high degree of turnover of political appointees. I think I don't know if I would have necessarily rewritten that, but I might have added something to that, which is perhaps a sort of a warning to a government that if you tear the degree to which you make changes, you should expect that your enemies would make the same changes in your position.
Sure.
Which I think is just trying to consider what the long-term implications are, and not necessarily only what you're doing, but that what you're doing is you're opening up the possibility of how much someone else could change things too. The Democrats, if they win, whatever, if there's a Democratic president at the next election, then they are well within their rights to make very extreme changes to the way that the US government is structured, on the basis that a very extreme change has been made this time. They're well within their rights to do that, I think, because a new precedent has been set around what's acceptable. I think the UK has some... the checks and balances in the US are being really tested. Maybe that's one of the silver linings of this. We'll have a real some evidence of how strong the checks and balances are in the US, tested to their real stress testing in real life. The UK has its own sets of checks and balances, and I think we even, Liz Truss being Prime Minister is a good example of a lesson that Donald Trump did not learn, perhaps, that the bond markets are quite powerful, and national debt can be more powerful than the electorate in terms of guiding your decision making and what you're able to do. We learned that the hard way, I think, with Liz Truss a couple of years ago, and Donald Trump's learned that recently.
Who's Liz Truss? Just kidding.
Great question, Jeff. Because Liz Truss is the shortest serving Prime Minister in UK history.
I'm aware.
Which I know you know. But your question sums up her time in office. So Liz Truss came in as a sort of radical libertarian, I would say, for us anyway. In the US, I think she'd sit much more comfortably. I think also perhaps the strength of her libertarian viewpoint did not align with the strength of her capabilities to deliver those things. And in the UK, we have an independent body called the Office for Budget Responsibility, who is supposed to look at any budget before it's announced. They sidelined the OBR.
Little parliamentary budget office.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They sidelined them, put out a budget which freaked everyone out, and the markets reacted extremely, and she sacked her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng quite quickly, and then she went. Then famously, she one of the tabloid newspapers had a lettuce and had a picture of a lettuce every single day, and she was out of office before the lettuce wilted, and so the Liz Truss lettuce,
But
she
Tom,
will be probably forever remembered.
One of the things, though, that going back to the issue of precedents, though, is as we look at the decline of democracy around the world, I think, there's an article that was written apparently about democracy practitioners coming home, right? That is that, many years ago, or even until a few years ago, there was a heavy emphasis on building democracy abroad. And now, as we see more and more countries slipping into authoritarianism, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is how do we democracy-proof our own countries? And when it comes to precedent, that's something that I wonder, do we need to start focusing more on making sure that we have much more clear standards and guidelines for the way that our democracy runs rather than running it on precedent? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good link, because I guess maybe one of my reflections on the sort of maybe what we would see as the decline of democracy is that democracy is being gamed everywhere. Either we're seeing a suffocation of the system to reduce the number of people voting, gerrymandering, redrawing districts and boundaries. The systems that whatever's in place is being gamed to the absolute. In the UK, we saw that in the last general election was the most efficient vote share ever by the Labour Party, who won the election.
Right.
And whatever criticism there is of the system, they played the system really well. So that's happening on one side of things, I think, and that's probably leading to some disenfranchisement. And on the other side, the type of gaming is to falsify a democracy and pretend that there's a democratic vote when there's not. Which is not very representative, and that is also I guess that's sort of taking advantage of goodwill, and perhaps we are beyond that era now, and actually there do need to be stronger guidances and systems in place to make sure that the intended system is happening in practice. But I have an issue myself with grand recommendations that never end up happening because they're just too big. So I'm hesitant when I say this, but there probably does need to be an agreement about what it should look like now. And I'm not sure every country has to land on their own system that they think is most representative, and the reality is that not everyone will agree. That's also the nature of democracy, isn't it? But
But
what
let's take a tangible.
is the purpose that we want everyone to be represented, or is the purpose
Right.
that everyone who actually bothers to vote should be?
Let's take a tangible example, and it's a small one. Let's take the example of what led to the resignation of our Prime Minister Trudeau, former Prime Minister now Trudeau, here in Canada in December. Actually, he resigned in January, but the incident took place in December, which was that there was a pre-budget statement delivered by the supposed to be delivered by the Minister of Finance, which is done by convention. There's no legal requirement for it to be tabled in the House of Commons. There's no legal requirement for it to be presented, but it is part of what I would call fiscal transparency, right? These are small parts of our what I would call our democracy. And maybe I'm the only one who cares about this topic, but what happened was that she ended up resigning the day that she was supposed to present the pre-budget statement, and so it was never actually formally presented in the House. It was never debated in the House. That there are really no repercussions. So politics really were front and center. Additionally, the federal government failed to table a budget during COVID, the COVID period. I think in 2021. So those would be a couple of examples where I would say, in terms of fiscal transparency, having the convention may not be good enough anymore.
Yeah.
And those are small things, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think something that I have gathered over years working in this space is that so much of politics is about feeling and how people feel about stuff, and a loss of confidence in a leader can be devastating. And I think also that so much decision making, either driven by polls or driven by pressure within a party or driven by people who are managing to shout loudest about a particular idea. A lot of decision making in government is fear driven in some manner. A lot of political decision making is driven by what a broader feeling is about something and whether there's sufficient confidence in that government to continue to operate. And I think I'm mainly speaking about sort of democratic governments in this manner, ones that can be removed by the electorate in any sort of transparent way. I think that how people feel is such a major part of how politics works, and in practice, that sometimes we're retrospectively looking for what was the straw that broke the camel's back, and actually the impact of that one thing, it could have been something else that would have done it, because overall confidence is lower, or there is a feeling that there needs to be change, or there is a feeling that the leader needs to move on, or they're carrying too much baggage, political baggage. You look at it sort of politically from a party perspective. Trudeau stepping down. Now we look at that and you say, what a great strategic move that was.
That's right. That's right.
But it might not have worked out that way. But now we look at it, we think,
no, but that's right.
That was actually the best thing you could have done.
Yeah. By hanging on too long. That's right. That's very true. Yeah. That people are saying that retroactively he's a genius, but at the time it
didn't seem like it.
It didn't seem like it. That's right. Let's get back to the book for a second. I want to talk about this stark contrast between the extensive training you mentioned in the Mind of the Minister, the stark contrast between the extensive training that civil servants receive and the really minimal preparation that's afforded to incoming ministers, who often assume their roles with a little notice and are not expected to be experts in their fields. Could you talk a bit more about that? How does that, affect the initial dynamics between ministers and civil servants? And what do you think needs to be done to bridge this gap, to foster more effective collaboration, et cetera, et cetera?
So I think that there's lots of differences between ministers and civil servants. I think there's three big overriding ones. The first is that the nature of a politician is to try and see things simply and communicate simply. simple messages, simple ideas, because those cut through and people understand them. Whereas public officials are there to deal in complexity, to look at all the possible implications, all the possible outcomes, all the possible options, and then bring them. So that's sort of simple versus complex. I think that's a big difference. I think that ministers naturally are thinking short term because they will not probably be in that role necessarily for that long, either for good reasons because they're promoted or bad reasons because they're demoted or removed. That that they're not in a job for life. Whereas a public official may be on a sort of career journey to become the absolute specialist maybe in the world in that particular area, and they could do that for decades conceivably. The minister will never do that. So then there's a short term, long term thinking. And then the final one is the sort of partial and impartial. So the minister is political. They are partisan and they have a worldview, either of their own or of their governments, that they are seeing that's what the lens through which they see stuff. And ultimately, public servants are supposed to be impartial. And that's the same in any context. I think aside from being a political appointee, if you were there permanently, you're trying to be impartial. So those big differences, I think, are important to consider in this sort of conversation around preparation and expertise. My view, as someone who works in learning, development and training, is that ministers are underprepared, that there are some things which would really benefit them to know in advance. And I do think that ministers on the whole, especially if they have under sort of 2-3 years of experience, would really benefit from someone at least coaching, someone who knows someone who's been there and done it before. So I think it should be someone who's been a minister. But the rapid sort of onboarding of knowledge and trying to get your head around what is almost certainly going to be a complex policy area is exhausting. The whole thing is it burns you out. And it's the whole thing is very extractive on energy. And I think most members of the public would say, well, good, it should be. They're in a privileged position. They're leading the country. They should work hard. We should get the most out of them we possibly can. But also, they are also human. And we're not, the reality of a democracy is you're not picking the best of the best for ministers. You are ending up with someone who survives every single round of voting, down from whatever happens at the local level or within a party structure or whatever. So it's not a meritocratic system. It's a popularity, in some manner, contest of which someone at the end comes out. Now, if that's what we want as a way of democratic representation, then also we should expect that we won't necessarily get people who are absolutely on top of their policy area, which is why I think then they could do with some help. Now, the other side of that is that everyone I talk to, permanent secretaries on the whole will say, ministers are pretty good at getting up to speed. The good ones know what they want. And I think something that I've found has been the best advice I would ever give to a minister is to have 2 or 3 things that you want to achieve in your time in post, probably 2, and absolutely set yourself on making sure that those 2 things happen. If you go beyond that, you probably won't achieve anything. So you've got to be very focused and accepting that your time is limited. And then I think most ministers say there's just not time. I'm in and I'm 100 miles an hour. There's not time to get my head around anything additional to what I'm already doing. So it is a tricky one. I don't think there's a set answer. My bias is towards people having more support to do a better job. I have a professional and personal bias towards that. But I also, I know that it's complicated. It's a tricky one to balance.
And as you know, a lot of the work that I do is focused on the disparity between the executive branch and the legislative branch in terms of capacity and access to information and knowledge. So if we extrapolate, new MPs and perhaps even opposition MPs sitting on an accountability committee like the Public Accounts Committee, and they're outgunned by a permanent secretary who's been there for 30 years.
Yeah.
What do you see as some of the ways to overcome those disparities?
The quality of advice has to be high to a minister. So I suppose what we have to do is kind of try and look at what's underneath. There's something that you might see on the TV, which is that interaction between the two, and one side looks like it's really well versed and the other does not. But I do think that members of scrutiny committees, the quality of the advice they have access to is important. I guess this is a parliamentary thing, and how can the structure and the system be better supportive of making sure that anyone in a scrutiny role has access to what they really need to hold anyone on the governing side to account. So maybe that's perhaps in your specific example there. I think, as we know from select committees and scrutiny committees and all sorts, there's quite a range often of different types of expertise. Some people have been on there for a while, are well versed and they know what's going on, and some are there to ask the sort of a question from the public, as it were. It's sort of less detailed, and we see that all the time, don't we? In terms of, but I do think that the quality of advice that ministers get, and then maybe on the other side that someone in a scrutiny role gets, I think that's a critical thing here, and that's not something that gets discussed in public very much. But that probably is part of the solution there, I think.
Fascinating. And I also want to talk about you raised the issue of diversity in your book on several occasions, and obviously, diversity, equity, and inclusion is very much under attack in the United States, and to some extent in Canada as well, and probably around the world. There are certainly benefits to diversity and having people around the table that are representative of the population in making decisions. But you also highlight some of the natural tensions that emerge when you have a more diverse group. And I think you really, anybody who's watched, including myself, of course, watched Yes Minister, or even The Sandbaggers, all these great British classics where all the white people are sitting in the club having sherries after dinner, right? Really highlights the fact that, as you put it, the world of government, particularly at senior levels, feels like a small one, but it used to be smaller. MPs, ministers, and civil servants all went to the same schools, were members of the same social clubs, intermarried and holidayed together. Relationships were built and strengthened in smoking rooms and cricket pavilions rather than in meeting rooms and networking events. You go on to say that collectively we've decided that this exclusive approach is unfair, unrepresentative, and overlooked too much talent, and that transparency, diversity, and meritocracy have sought to replace the opaque, homogenous, and nepotistic ways of the past. You see this as a positive change, but you see that the change comes at a cost. What's that cost that you're referring to?
I think the cost is the shortcuts. So I think in the sort of the old ways, which I hope I made clear that I am not supportive of, but in those old ways, the shortcuts are to have a very similar worldview, whereby you don't need to navigate quite as much conflict. You don't need to navigate. You don't need to sort of build as much understanding of other people around you. That really you're sort of coming into it with lots of pre-built social relationships in place, pre-built networks of people that are in other roles that would be helpful to the role that you're doing. A very small world, and I think sometimes if you're just trying to achieve something and get something done quickly, having lots of people that have a very similar, that are all on the same page and would approach that problem in the same way, can be a really quick and effective way of doing something. But ultimately, it's a very narrow way of operating. So you lose creativity, you lose solutions, you lose you lose a viewpoint and a view of things outside of your quite narrow way of your narrow lens, and that's not a viable way to operate in today's world, which is interconnected either. We're not as isolationist. Even with all the things that are happening in the US at the moment, and all these attempts to be isolationist, there's nobody after Donald Trump that will manage to carry that one. JD Vance, nobody, because it's a once in a lifetime force of character trying to do something which almost certainly will not work because the forces of the rest of the world are too strong. The world as it is today, it's not feasible to have such a narrow way of operating, and but the cost is that you have to try and build a lot of those connections from a start. And also, you've got lots of, it's more difficult to manage lots of different perspectives and lots of different voices. It takes more energy and effort. No, I think it's worth the extra energy and the effort, but it's harder than everyone just agreeing and having a pretty much the same view of the world in the same direction. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think one of the challenges. Trying to see a rounded view, right, of the world. I think one of the things which I think maybe kind of like the sort of Trump MAGA world, one of the things that they're reacting against is that the world around them seems to have changed and they didn't feel like they were part of that decision or that conversation. And perhaps from the other side of the table, you say, well, that's because there was one particular group that had enormous privilege in basically every single area at the cost of everybody else. Switch back to the MAGA view, and it's that, yeah, but hold on, that's the change back. The change to whatever we're doing now is at the cost of us. And I think you still have to acknowledge that the change always costs something to people, even if you're still going ahead with the change.
But
I think it's important to, yeah. Mm-hmm. So go on.
No, are you suggesting that there's a cost between the minister-civil servant relationship, or there has been a cost, or an adjustment period, let's say?
I think it's easier to operate, and it's easy. I mean, a massive theme of this book is about trust, and it's easier to. I think there's a few different components of building trust, and this is not perfect. And even since I've written the book, I think I've evolved my thinking about some of these big trust components in the professionally, right? But so very, very quickly, I think that you're sort of looking at authenticity between yourselves and honesty, logic really being about understanding your worldview and how what you're suggesting makes sense and understanding how that happens. Being able to be empathetic to the other person's point of view and understanding where they're coming from. And then, so for those three things, if you're all from the same very small world, they're a lot easier to do because being empathetic to their own experience is likely to be quite similar to your own. The logic is very similar in both instances because you have probably a very similar worldview. And the openness and authenticity culturally are from basically the same background. Actually, you're probably likely to have quite a similar way of communicating and to each other. So this is such a massive shortcut if you're basically from the same social circle, which is what was the case in this country for a very long time.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I remember listening to a podcast which was probably one of the most fascinating things I ever heard, which is that it's a lot easier for a democracy to function in either a homogeneous society or a society where you have a ruling class where others are being deliberately kept out of the equation. And as soon as you get that diversity, that potentially creates a lot more conflict. And it's harder to run that society. So I think that's probably going to be the title of your next book, which is to figure out what are the implications of having that diverse society, and how do we include those voices in dialogue and in decision making.
If we look at India at a very high level, and we look at the sort of reign of, I think that's the wrong word, but the incumbency of Narendra Modi, and the observation that the strength of government in India has increased over that time, there is a correlation with a drive to a more homogenous representation in government within India, and it's a nationalistic drive to the way that government has operated. With the and part of that narrative is not to include everyone in the same manner. So I think there is something in that
Mhm.
that sort of restricting access makes things easier and can make a government stronger. But I think perhaps in lots of democratic countries, one of the purposes of democracy is that you can remove leaders that you don't want in place anymore, and uh, the ability to do that is reduced um, through the mechanism of making a more homogenous form of government. So I think it's a big conversation. It's a big
It's a
topic.
big one. This is just me venting, but I have been thinking about the fact that the more homogenous the government, the more yes men you get.
Mm.
You
Yeah,
you get a lot of excess. You get a lot of
yeah,
people who aren't contributing intellectually to the exercise, who are, the point of view is so narrow that and I think we're certainly seeing that in the United States, but we see it elsewhere as
yeah,
well.
yeah. And you can make mistakes, and crises come quicker than they ever have, and the ability to respond to a crisis is curtailed by having too narrow a view, I think.
When we first had it, I'll put this out as the concluding question. But when we first had a chat about this, about your book several months ago, just offline, I asked you about the ability of ministers to handle complex issues. I don't want to say files, issues like
Mm.
climate change, like poverty. Um, Given all that we've said, all that you said about the relationship between civil servants and ministers, how much can a minister really contribute to solving systemic endemic problems at the time that they've got in office?
I think at those nearly macro level issues, I don't think an individual minister can change those. I think a government as a whole needs to be committed, and I think just realistically, I think you could probably only do one at a time. Um, like, but economically, in a rich country, you could, if you were committed to eradicating poverty, you could do that at probably the expense of other things. But if a government decided it wanted to eradicate, if in a rich country, of which the definition of that seems pretty clear by
Yep.
OECD metrics,
Yep.
you could eradicate poverty in every rich country, and the government could do that themselves, economically and financially, in one term. But that would be probably at the expense of some other things, and politically might not be viable depending on the mandate you have. And I think that's a big problem, is that governing is complicated, and probably pretty much from day one you're just dealing with all sorts of challenges you didn't know existed whilst you were in opposition because they're not public. And it's difficult to govern. Politics makes governance difficult. Um, it's the price of democracy, I suppose.
Rise of democracy. So earlier, I made a comment about your next book, which kind of preempted the question I was going to ask, which is what's your next book going to be about?
Well, I don't know yet, Jan. Um, I have
I
an
realize it's
idea.
a very provocative, unfair question.
Yeah, an area that I'm quite interested in is special advisors, so political advisors. I think that the world of political advisors has changed an enormous amount in the last 30 or 40 years. And I'm really interested in, we talk about ministers coming in without any training, or political advisors. Their training is just whatever they've done before. And they come in and they are making decisions often on behalf of ministers. The minister, obviously, of course, makes the absolute decision, but when we talk about the mind of the minister, the special advisor is the one who's supposed to really understand them enough to speak like them and to suggest they will agree to this or they will not agree to that. Um, I think there's a really interesting world of political advice that I suspect there's lots more to uncover. And I think it will be quite difficult. There are some special advisors that have written books about their own experiences, and there are always limitations to what someone can share just about themselves. So perhaps a similar type of mixture of on and off the record unveiling might be a good way to see.
I love the topic.
I
love it because that those are the kids in their 20s
absolutely,
who were running amok with Elon Musk in the Doge case, right?
Yeah.
Not understanding how government works. Now that may be an exceptional case, but we look at Canada, we call them the boys in short pants. Of course, it's not just boys; it's men and women. But the unelected advisors, yes, I think that's a topic that really fascinates me because I think it's part of what is the cause of the centralization of power in the hands of our executive branch in Canada. Not only the Prime Minister's office, but also at the provincial level in provinces as well.
And we've seen examples in the UK, and it will be the case elsewhere too, that there also can be a tool for centralisation in terms of the controlling ministers. And we saw that with a very powerful advisor who was chief of staff at one point, Dominic Cummings, who did centralise the pool or attempted to centralise the pool of special advisors, and then send them back out to ministers. So they weren't working for the minister anymore; they were working for him. People called him the Prime Minister whilst Boris Johnson was there. So there's all sorts of ways that this can be used and reused and repurposed, etc., repackaged. I think it's an interesting world. And it's not much, it's quite shady, really. I don't mean shady as in dodgy, but I just mean behind a curtain. Most people don't know what's happening in the world of advisors.
Absolutely. Good. I can't wait to see the book. I'm just teasing you. And congratulations. I understand that you've posted the fact that it's on the best. Your book is on the bestseller list.
Yeah.
This podcast doesn't usually interview authors of any kind, let alone people who are. That's not true. Actually, we have interviewed some authors, but I don't think anyone who's been on the bestseller list. So, quite an honor.
Thanks very much.
And congratulations, Tom. It's a monumental accomplishment to do something like that. I'm really glad that we took the time to chat about your book.
Hey, it's always great to speak with you, Jeff, and thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks a million. Tom Brown, the author of In the Mind of the Minister. Thanks again.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.